So after the first 100 years of real colonial settlement, how were things going?
Well, what had been going on in the colonies from, say, 1630 to 1730 was they really were developing and establishing institutions of government, population-based, business institutions. They were becoming kind of their own little world that could live independent to some degree from the mother country. And in that period of time, you had generations developing who were born in the colonies. You had Americans being born, not just transplants from England or from the Netherlands or France. And that, coupled with the institutions, started giving people a sense that they were Americans and not just subjects of the crown.
The question is, what did the British do that ticked off the American colonists so much that we had to have a revolution? The first problem began in 1733, and it had to do with rum, the most popular alcoholic beverage of the colonies. Rum is made from molasses, a syrup that is made from sugar cane. Rum was manufactured in New England, where sugar cane does not grow. So the distillers in such places as Boston bought their molasses from places like the British West Indies, meaning Jamaica and Barbados, and also from the Spanish Caribbean and some French Caribbean possessions. Here is a perhaps oversimplified diagram of how the supply system worked. The sea captain, starting in Boston, loaded up his ship with a lot of cheap rum and sailed to various places in Africa. There they traded the rum for slaves, who were supplied not only by white European slave traders, but also by black African tribal leaders who would kidnap members of other tribes and sell them into slavery.
Usually around 1760, 110 gallons would get you a human being. 110 gallons of cheap rum, not very high quality rum, would get a human being to be loaded up on the ship. Most of those slaves went back to the Caribbean, where they grew more sugarcane to make more molasses to go back up to New England.
The ship then sailed to the Caribbean, where the sugarcane plantations were. The demand for new slaves was constant, as working the fields growing and harvesting sugarcane was brutal work.
And what the Molasses Act said of 1733 was the colonials basically in New England, but also other colonies, could only get their molasses from the British possessions, which would be Barbados and Jamaica. Barbados and Jamaica were more valuable to the crown than all of the colonies combined, because that's where they also got their sugar.
Well, of course, they traded the slaves for molasses, which was then taken to Boston and sold to the rum manufacturers for cash, and for rum to take to Africa to start the process over again. Now, England, which in effect owned the colonies, didn't like this deal because they were not dominating the molasses business. Remember, there were those Spanish and French islands and plantations as well. So in 1733, the Parliament in London passed the Molasses Act that basically said the New England rum makers could not buy their molasses from the Spanish or French, but only from the British West Indies, meaning only from Jamaica and Barbados. This law, one could say, ticked off the Americans, but they quickly developed ways to get around it.
Getting the molasses became a bit of a problem because what was happening was that the amount of molasses that colonial rum industry needed could never be supplied by the British West Indies, which would be Jamaica and Barbados. There was only a fraction that those could provide. So what the colonials were doing was buying the molasses from the Spanish and from the French and other parts of the Caribbean, mostly the Spanish Caribbean. All right, what happens then, see, the Molasses Act of 1733 was designed to prevent that, and it didn't really work, and it was all brought in through petty bribery and graft and corruption, which allowed industry to continue going. And smuggling.
Okay, so for a long time, London did not really send its A-team of investigators to enforce the Molasses Act, and the colonists got by with lots of petty bribery and smuggling, viewed by some as a perfectly honorable profession.
There were, I may be over-exaggerating here, but I think there were families in the Rhode Island area, which was rampant with smugglers, who listed as their occupation smuggler. If they took a census, it was a perfectly honorable thing to do.
For the Massachusetts rum makers, it was all working fine. But down the road, around 1754, things changed. England and the colonists were engaged in what we call the French and Indian War. We were fighting the French, and to a lesser degree the Spanish, and certain Indian tribes over control of the Ohio River Valley. In practical terms, this was a war about who was going to dominate the American continent. We'll get to the impact of that war in a moment, but the British King and Parliament realized that if Boston rum makers were still buying molasses from the Spanish and French Caribbean, it was actually putting money in the pockets of those we were fighting a war against. Quickly, the Crown sent over a tougher lot of, let's call them molasses police.
So they start to have to enforce the Molasses Act of 1733. And what they do to enforce it, among many measures, is writs of assistance, which is a general search warrant that allows the person holding the writ to the assistance of any Crown official to go search your house, your warehouse, your bedroom, any place, without specificity, to look for contraband molasses. And that's what it was all about. And that's what they fought against and reacted to.
The key words you just heard were without specificity. In other words, a search warrant that didn't have to say what they were searching for, nor any reason to believe that you might possess those things they didn't know they were searching for. This colonial experience is what later led to the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which reads, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the person or things to be seized." So you see, our protections against unreasonable searches all began because the colonists liked their rum. But let's get back to the French and Indian War. We won't go through the battles, but there were some factors that would shape our later success in the Revolution.
Well, the interesting thing about the French and Indian War, which was in Europe actually called the 7 Years' War, for one thing, people don't realize it was probably actually the first world war. It was fought on a global scale, which is the one small part of it was the French and Indian War that happened in Americas. The first thing is our American military, George Washington, for instance, they gained their training as military leaders in the French and Indian War and their competence as commanders, which meant by the time of the Revolution, they were of age to take over command and knew what to do to form an army.
So you see, at the American Revolution, Washington and his colleagues had a real advantage from their experience in the French and Indian War. Well, the war was won. England would be the dominant player in the New World. But as it turned out, not everyone was happy, especially not the American colonists who had joined up and fought. After the peace treaty was signed, King George III issued a proclamation which by today's standards might well make sense. His approach was to order, at least for the time being, that the colonists could not infringe or migrate and settle on Indian lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. Nor could colonists or land developers even purchase land from Indians. London argued that they wanted an organized, regulated, peaceful approach to dealing with the Western tribes, reconcile them to British rule, and avoid future hostilities. The king, with the Royal Proclamation of 1763, basically said to the former soldiers, "Thanks, boys, for all your fighting and dying. We now own that great land in the Ohio Valley and beyond, but you're not allowed to go settle there." You can imagine how well that was swallowed in 1763.
Okay, what I think you have to understand is that the end of the French and Indian War meant that the American colonists no longer felt dependent upon Great Britain for defense. They had defeated the major European power that had restrained their expansion westward, the French. It now looked like that there was new opportunities across the Appalachian Mountains, that there was no reason anymore for the American colonists to worry quite so much about their dependence upon Great Britain. They also felt that having participated in that war, that they were equals now, that they were kin with the empire, that they were not subordinates, they were not children anymore.
The next year, 1764, George III and the Parliament in London began some actions that, to the colonists, added insult to injury, or more likely added injury to injury. In short, he said, "We fought this war over there in your neighborhood for the benefit of you so-called Americans, and it left us with a lot of financial debt, so we think it's only fair that you should pay for it." Of course, he didn't mention that the French and Indian War was just part of a much larger conflict known as the 7 Years' War, which England had been fighting all over Europe. So Britain began to impose on the colonists certain new taxes, as well as certain new laws. Some at first may not have seemed all that offensive. For example, the Sugar Act.
The Sugar Act of 1764, the purpose of it was to try to work with the colonials a little bit and relieve some of the burdens of the Molasses Act of 1733. Remember, when you're talking about molasses and sugar, you're really talking about the same thing. It's the same commodity. And the idea behind it was to allow for Crown enforcement, but to kind of relieve some of the tariffs. So it was the idea to bring them in. And as we go through these different acts of parliaments, you get the Sugar Act, the Intolerable, all the way to the Intolerable Acts. What you basically have is they're a reflection of what's going on in Parliament at the time, and the British government trying to figure out how best to deal with the colonial problem. So sometimes some of the acts are more beneficial to the colonies, and some of the acts are more restrictive and going back and forth.
Before we go on with the actions England took against the colonies, let's pause here in 1765, a bit more than 10 years before the Revolution, and let me go out on a limb to say something I think most historians would agree with. If at that point in time the British Parliament and King George III had been a little wiser, used better judgment, if they'd had a better understanding of who these Americans were, and especially if George and the Parliament had started to make more thoughtful decisions, there may not have been a revolution. It would have been very possible that today's USA would still be part of Great Britain, the United Kingdom. Think of it, the Beatles might have been from New Jersey. But the Brits had other priorities in mind. At first, it was all about money. England was in a poor financial situation, and they saw the colonies as a source of new tax revenues, a cash cow, if you will. Later, their mistakes were about wanting to punish the Americans. Let's look at the list. The year after the Sugar Act was passed, the Parliament came up with another one that started making important enemies.
The Stamp Act was also very interesting because it really showed how Britain was beginning to encroach on the lives of individual people. The Stamp Act is called the Stamp Act, and of course it applied to stamps, postage. But it also applied to pretty much everything that was printed, from newspapers all the way down to playing cards, because they were all supposed to be printed on stamped paper that had the tax paid. Now this is part of the things that start radicalizing certain people, most notably Benjamin Franklin, because his job was, he was a publisher. So now every time Benjamin Franklin wanted to publish something, he had to do it on stamped paper. And so Benjamin Franklin, who, by the way, also, given the fact that he was a pretty thrifty guy, was the postmaster general for different colonies and later the whole colonies, a position he later lost. So he is intricately involved in all this stuff, and it's part of what begins the process of leading him, an establishment guy, to revolution.
The Stamp Act of 1765 caused such rioting, boycotts, and threats of revolution in the colonies that Parliament repealed it the next year. At about the same time, they passed the first Quartering Act. This required colonial governments to pay for housing, feeding, and supplying British soldiers. Some colonial assemblies refused to abide by the act, so to show some muscle, the British decided to make an example of New York and disbanded its legislature. Well, Britain insisted it still needed more tax revenue, so the next year they passed the Townshend Act of 1767, named after Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. That would be like Parliament's treasurer. The new law charged customs duties. That is a tax paid to England on products imported from England arriving in the colonies. Among the things so taxed were glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. American colonists, as one might expect, again organized a boycott, not only of those products. Massachusetts was the hotbed of resistance to these laws. Boston merchants in particular promoted the boycott. They persuaded their colonial assembly to send a letter out to all the other colonies, urging them to join the resistance and spread the word. London retaliated by dissolving the Massachusetts Legislative Assembly. With their legislative representatives sent home, angry citizens turned to mob activity. So the Crown, in October 1767, sent 4 regiments of British soldiers to effect a military occupation of Boston and to help enforce the taxation on glass, lead, paints, paper, and tea. As one might imagine, things went downhill from there. Scuffles between citizens and soldiers were common, and things came to a head on March 5th, 1770. In Boston, a fairly large group of men were holding what today we would call a protest rally. Perhaps 50 feet away stood a company of armed British soldiers monitoring the situation. As yet, there had been no physical altercation between the two groups, but surely the young Bostonians loudly chanted slogans and taunted the soldiers. Suddenly, the British unit opened fire, killing 5 protesters. 3 died there, 2 others later from wounds. It was immediately called the Boston Massacre and significantly fanned the flames of colonial resentment. The funerals were reportedly organized as great patriotic demonstrations. 9 soldiers were tried for murder. Ironically, their very effective defense lawyer was John Adams, soon to be a leader of the Revolution and destined to become the 2nd President of the United States. Of the 9 soldiers charged, 7 were acquitted. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter, punished, and tossed out of the British Army. It is said that at the trial evidence was presented that amid the noise before the shooting, it was a colonist who loudly yelled, "Fire!" The soldiers thought it was an order from their captain. It was not. In London, the King and the Parliament were surely frustrated by the direction of events. British public opinion may have come into play as well. 5 weeks after the shootings, the Parliament repealed most of the Townshend Acts. Well, if Boston Massacre is a famous colonial phrase, then Boston Tea Party is even more so. The one part of the Townshend Acts that was not repealed was the duty, the export tax on tea. It's been suggested that the English government left that in place just to save face after repealing everything else. To the colonists, it wasn't a big deal compared to what was to happen next. England had a royally chartered business concern called the East India Company that traded around the world and with the colonies. In 1773, the company was near bankruptcy, and the British government decided to bail them out. So Parliament passed the Tea Act that 1. Gave East India Company a complete monopoly on all tea exported to the colonies, and 2. Gave East India a complete exemption on the export tax, even though all other private shipping companies had to pay the fees. Why would the colonists care about this? Well, the big issue was that under this new law, tea in the colonies could only be sold by the East India Company through merchants who worked for them. In other words, regular colonial stores were no longer allowed to sell tea. It put them out of the tea business. Still, if a colonist did buy some tea at the East India store, he had to pay an external tax on his purchase, meaning tax revenues that went directly to London. This British policy on tea pushed many American merchants in New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, and, of course, Boston in the direction of revolution. In Boston, 3 ships leased by the East India Company, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived with cargoes of tea. Well, on the night of December 16, 1773, some Boston colonists said to be dressed as Indians boarded the ship and dumped the tea overboard. Some historians view the details of the incident as folklore.
The Tea Act was an attempt to extract the tariffs and customs from tea. One of the things people don't really realize about the Boston Tea Party was it was not a protest against taxes. It was a protest because the ships in Boston Harbor were not paying taxes. They weren't paying the custom. They were part of the British East India Company, which had a monopoly from the Crown to bring tea into the colonies. So the local colonial importers had to pay the custom. The ships, which were the Eleanor, the Dartmouth, and the Beaver, which were the three ships in the Boston Tea Party that were involved, those ships didn't have to pay the custom for their tea. And that's what the protest was all about. Now, this whole stuff about the Sons of Liberty, they dressed up as little Mohawk Indians, everybody knew that was baloney. During the entire thing, they only broke one lock, and they sent a locksmith the next day to fix it. Another thing people don't realize, the value of the tea that they threw in Boston Harbor was probably worth about $2 million in today's dollars. There on the ships was an equal or greater amount of hard cider. The hard cider didn't end up in Boston Harbor. They rolled that back to the Sons of Liberty bar, where they took care of the hard cider that way. It was only the tea that ended up in Boston Harbor.